issue, it was very obvious what Seventh-day Adventist stance was until the war actually came. There had been problems before that in places around Europe, but now it was full-fledged. What were they going to do when the Kaiser was mobilizing all the young men of Germany, for example, and eventually it affected 16 countries in Europe in terms of how Adventists would react to it. A classical example was a minister in Germany who preached a sermon one Sabbath telling the people that we must stay out of military service. We cannot serve God and serve our military commanders. Sister White had said that very plainly in 361. I'll be reading that statement on Sabbath afternoon of the first volume of the Testimonies. We had to keep 1,000 miles away from service in the army. We got 17,000 young people, Seventh-day Adventist young people in the United States Army, according to the records that are kept in the General Conference. I cannot believe it, except for the apostasy that's come in since we were lads and we were taught a different way under those circumstances. However, that will be a time for another meeting. But there were those listening to that sermon, they were saying amen. It was a marvelous sermon. The next week, the same pastor got up to try to convince them they should go fully into war. The same pastor. The people couldn't believe it. They thought their pastor had lost his mind. But what they discovered was he'd had word from the European Union, or sometimes it was called the European Division. And it had come down from the highest level of Elder Conradi and Elder Schmidt, the Union president, to the churches, been sent out, that they had written to the Kaiser and told him the Seventh-day Adventists would serve as other loyal Germans in behalf of the fatherhood and would serve even on Sabbath if it was necessary. Now, that letter is extant, by the way, what was written by our German leadership. Well, belatedly, that was 1914. The people were absolutely aghast, and many of them refused to accept it. Some of these men that refused to ended up in prison. Some lost their lives. But all over Europe, there was a small group that refused to take this situation of breaking the fourth and the sixth commandments. A small group of Seventh-day Adventists. Very dedicated people. And the brethren in the division first said, well, we give everyone the right to make their own decision, but this is our stand. Well, I've always found that when you give everyone the right to make their own decision, of course everyone has a conscience to make his or her own decision if they exercise it. However, most people will just follow blindly without searching for themselves. If the brethren say it, it must be right. Now, I hope that most of the time that what the brethren say is right. Not always the case. In fact, today it's less and less the case. However, you've got to search for yourself. We are Protestants. We believe in the priesthood of all believers, don't we? We believe that the Bible is the only foundation of our faith and practice. Therefore, if that is true, which I believe with all my heart, then we can only use inspiration to make our decisions on these issues. And but the group that stood out, they soon found that there wasn't freedom for them to make their own conscience. As our leaders wrote, decrying this small group that were bringing a bad name to Seventh-day Adventists. Many of them ended up in prison. Many lost their lives in prison. I'm not talking about going to some prison in the United States. I'm talking about these military prisons, which were absolutely ruthless places to go. And there they were forced to work on Sabbath, which they refused to do, and the floggings and all the deprivations and going into these isolation, totally darkened cells, all the miserable things that happened. Many lost their lives. Others were condemned to death and were shot. One young man in Poland was 17 when he took his stand. Well, the Polish laws did not allow for anyone to be executed under the age of 18, so they waited till his 18th birthday and shot him. These were faithful Seventh-day Adventists. I'll never forget in 1960s, a Romanian man was visiting Australia, and I discovered that he had been thrown into prison in Romania because he refused to just to go into the army. And in the end, he showed me the shocking scars on his thighs. Now, he was a man at that time in his early 70s. But he'd been 19 at the time he was thrown into prison. He survived. There were four of them together that had taken a stand from the same church, and they were thrown in together. 3 of them survived the war. Tragically, 1 did not survive. But these old scars, I'm not talking about little kind of marks on his legs. You could see he'd been walloped. Must have been terrible situation. I saw it with my own eyes, what happened to that man for his faith. And yet they were condemned as fanatics and as disloyal to the church. Many of them, about 2,000 of them, were disfellowshipped in various parts of Central and Eastern Europe. at that time. One of the earliest cases actually was in Scandinavia before the First World War. A Danish young man. He was also, I believe, 19 at the time. And I tell you, that poor young man went through terrible tortures in Denmark because he refused to join the Danish army or military. These men, some died for their faith, others were willing to die if necessary for their faith. I'm going to be reading a couple of letters on Sabbath afternoon of two men, one in Germany, one in Austria, their last letters before their execution in the Second World War. Young people here, and we've got a number scattered around. I want you to know these people are going to be wearing, I believe, the red around their beautiful white robes as martyrs to their faith, while our leaders were actually not only not helping them, they were going to court to speak against them. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that. One in Australia, by the way, a man that told me his own personal story. And I'll tell you another man, the man in Germany, who was shot, executed, and sadly was talking about what his pastor had done in the court hearing, the military court hearing. I tell you, and we have never recovered from that. And if there was another war, as we've got now, the Iraqi war here, I felt so sad when I heard the first Adventists had been killed in Iraq. I felt the same when I heard the first Adventists had been killed in Vietnam. It should never have been, unless it was an execution for standing for your faith. So, okay.